This is topic B on page 81, tracing cells.
As users can introduce errors nearly anywhere within a workbook, tracking down errors is an important first step in resolving them. Additionally, errors aren't always obvious. Sometimes your only clue that a workbook contains an error at all is that some of the data on your worksheets doesn't seem to fit with surrounding figures. In these cases, you'll want to identify precisely which cells are feeding the erroneous data. That way you can systematically check the data, formulas, or functions in only the cells that affect the erroneous result. But reading over the content in numerous cells to track which other cells feed into them can be a painstaking and error-prone process. Fortunately, you don't always have to scour your worksheets, carefully examining each formula or function to track down erroneous data feeding your formulas. Excel provides you with a clear graphical method for determining precisely how the cells in your workbooks can connect to one another, and that's cell tracing. Taking advantage of this type of functionality will give you an instant snapshot of the relationships that exist in your workbooks. This means you don't have to painstakingly examine large, complex workbooks to isolate issues affecting your data and analysis. So precedent and dependent cells. There are two basic types of relationships cells can have to one another. One cell can feed data into another, or it can be fed data by another cell. Cells that feed data into other cells are known as precedent cells. These cells precede other cells in a chain of relationships. Cells that contain a formula or function that is fed by data in other cells are known as dependent cells. These cells depend on the data in other cells to perform some calculation. And we have an option for tracing these cells. Let's say I have cell F4 selected, and I want to find out what cells are feeding into this particular cell. Can go up to my formulas group, and in my formula auditing command group, here I have the trace precedence and trace dependence commands. So I want to see what cells feed into this, which ones precede them. So I'm going to trace precedence, and it's showing me that all four of these cells, B4 through E4, are all feeding into F4. And we know that because we can simply take a look at the formula. It's taking the sum of B4 through E4. So again, these are all precedent cells to F4. And I can remove those arrows using the command on my ribbon. Now we can also see what cells depend on this. What is this feeding into? Because you can be a precedent cell and a dependent cell at the same time. So this cell depends on B4 through E4. And it's also a precedent cell preceding or feeding into at least cell F9. So I can trace the dependence of this cell, and it actually shows me F9 is dependent on F4, also F11, F12, G4, and also I4. So all of those cells are dependent on F4. So F4 is actually a dependent cell and a precedent. It precedes these cells, and it is dependent on these four cells here. And you have the option again to remove your arrows. Now, when you have those arrows shown, there's actually three different types of arrows that you'll see in your workbooks. You'll see blue arrows, and this traces relationships of cells on the same worksheet that you're located on. And you also might see a red arrow, and this traces relationships of cells to other cells that contain formulas or function errors. And also black dashed line arrows. These trace relationships of cells to other cells on different worksheets or in different workbooks. So let's see. You can see when I trace the dependence of cell H7, it gives me a red trace arrow because it is dependent. It is preceding cell I7, which is also an error. So that's showing an error trace cell. I'm going to remove those. I'll see if I can find a black dashed line arrow. Let's see. Don't think anything's going to be going into a different workbook. No, I don't think so. But in our activity, you'll actually see an example of a black dashed arrow, and that's just having precedent cells that are coming from a different workbook. So you're making a calculation. Let's say, here, let's do this. If I did, just for example purposes, if I did equals sum of F12 or not even the sum, if I just did equals F12 and multiplied that by my commission sale of 5%, let's say, and then I traced the precedent cells feeding into this, you can see F12 shows a blue line because that's feeding into H11. Also have this black dashed line because it's coming from a different worksheet. So if I double click that, it'll show me the actual syntax of the range or cell reference that it's indicating, and I can click on it from that link, click OK, and it will jump me to the cell or range on the other worksheet or workbook that it's coming from. So again, that's a dashed black line coming from a different worksheet or a different workbook. All right,
Your next video will be Activity 4.2 on page 85.